Thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you today. Just by way of introduction, I'm Martin Herbert. I'm based in the Grantham office of Brown&Co, one of the original founding partners of the Brown&Co team. Started many years ago, and I, as you may see from the colour of my hair, I've had a few years in this industry and I've seen a lot of change. I did start life acting for mainly landlords, and since then I've obviously done a lot of work acting for tenants, done a lot of tender work. I've also a fairly broad spectrum of experience in dealing with renewable technologies and particularly planning. So I do come to the table with quite a bit of experience in the sector, and also I do partake. I am a member of the RICS working party on tenancies and sit on the committee that deals with farm business tenancy agreements. So obviously I am quite familiar with the changes and indeed the things that need to be done looking at agreements in the future. If you could just move to the next slide. So I'm going to today touch on just a very quick reminder about the principal issues affecting tenancies, and there's clearly a whole plethora of other types of agreement that we have to contend with from time to time. But in this, for the focus of this particular webinar, I'm looking really at the main legislation that relates to Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies, formulated from the most recent primary legislation in 1984 and 1986, and also from then the Agricultural Tenancies Act 1995. The key issues really for that is security. As most of you will probably know, under an agricultural tenancy agreement and on the agricultural tenancies for the farm business tenancies, the security is for the duration of the tenancy, although tenancies can continue from year to year, but they're terminable. The one thing as tenants that you need to remember is the security which you may have for the Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies, which are for lifetime at least, and for those tenancies which were formulated prior to 1984, then obviously there's also succession, and now that is a very valuable commodity in your armory when you're talking to landlords and indeed to protect your family's future on the farm. The agreements we have to contend with are extremely wide-ranging, and it's fair to say that a lot of the issues which we're having to contend with today, looking at the changes that are coming in the industry, really are not accommodated in certainly a lot of the older agreements. I've actually sat on committees and actually dealt with the industry and the tenancy position since the dates before IACS, and of course I've seen the transition through IACS to AAPS to BPS, and of course now we're looking at, in this COVID world, also the strains that the industry will go through as we move into Brexit and all this new subsidy regime which we're bringing. So BPS of course is the latest, and entitlements, one major factor here is that what has happened over time is there's been quite a lot of controversy in the effectively delinking, which I will come to in more detail later, because the old systems used to be based on claims made against land, and that meant obviously that a landlord would obviously preserve their interest in that land. But now that has been converted, the right to claim, although it needs land, to entitlements. That has actually put money into the tenant's pocket, in the sense that those entitlements are theirs. They are potentially theirs to keep, subject to, and I do make a very strong caveat there, what contractual obligations there are in the tenancy agreement. So we move on to the next slide, if we may. One thing that clearly that is a major problem is, where is the rent at the moment, and where are we going in the future? We've got huge uncertainty that is facing the industry at the moment. And of late, it is probably fair to say, in terms of recent experiences, there's been very little change in rents that have been payable in the sector of Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies. One of the problems with that has clearly been the costs of actually moving forward for a rent review, and there'll be more on that later as we look at the new legislation which is coming through. I think one of the problems is that nobody really knows quite where we'll be at the moment, as Greg has illuminated. We have some very good ideas, and some of the things I'll talk about later relating to the agricultural bill will be subject to regulation, which obviously will introduce the detail, and the devil will be in the detail, and it's obviously clearly what we all need to do to take a shape. I think the main thing to say about rent reviews is that whilst we all need to reflect on what has happened in the past, the key issue here is actually trying to reflect on what is actually going to happen in the future. And of course, that is all related to change. Yes, we've had a very tough time recently. We've had huge variations in commodity prices. Incomes have fallen. There's also been times when certain sectors have done reasonably well. It's a balance. And of course, the main thing for gaining from past experiences, we've all got data now in terms of productivity of the holding, but what we're finding difficult to predict is where the subsidies and where the commodity prices will be as we move into a new world. If I'm actually just flick to the next slide briefly, the formula that I just wanted to illustrate the sort of the key, very briefly, the key issue when it comes to dealing with Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies. And I think the first paragraph under there neatly summarizes the position, which is that it's what it might be reasonably expect to let by a prudent and willing landlord to a prudent and willing tenant, taking into account all relevant factors. I think the key emphasis there is prudence, which is, and I think that's a key aspect that I think that as tenants working with landlords, we need prudence in everything we do to make sure that there is a clearly gain for landlord in securing possession of their farms. But if it is a long-term working relationship, which is clearly something we'd always encourage people to try and do, to work together, then if a landlord is clearly charging too much rent, that can reflect on other things that happen on the farm, particularly the want of repair and the way the land is treated. So clearly there needs to be prudence. The main thing there is also looking at, and clearly when I'll come to this in a second, when we deal with rent reviews, is looking at the productive capacity of holding and its related earning capacity. And I think all of those are relatively straightforward tests and applications which we need to do when we're starting to discuss the rent formulae. And the main thing also just to draw to your attention to is the disregards. We've clearly got to make sure that we understand the case and everybody is aware of what improvements the tenant has. It's incredible how we found where we've inherited files of where we're acting for tenants or where we're acting for landlords, that sometimes it's not known who spent the money doing the work, which must be disregarded. It's important to make sure that factually you've prepared your case. And clearly also grant aiding. I mean, I remember the great days when we used to get 60% grants towards drainage schemes. Clearly that element of a landlord's improvement should be disregarded. If we can move to the next slide, just which was, this is on agricultural tenancies. Just to illustrate really the difference there, I think that most regularly farm business tenancies are of a shorter duration, although there is something again which relates to negotiation with landlord later that's worth referring back to. But most rents on farm business tenancies are geared to open market lettings, and indeed the first paragraph there actually illustrates that well. It's what it might reasonably be expected to be let on the open market. So that's where tender rents come to play, and more on that later. So I think otherwise the disregards are very similar to what we've had in the past. So I don't know whether, Megan, you could just slip back a couple of slides, please, to the one before that, if I may. Just really, this is just to illustrate then the top tips. I think the important thing here, this is quite a complex area, is getting advice. It's really helpful so you know what to do, what to prepare for, how we put together the budgets and comparables, and obviously understanding what notices need to be served. Always remember that in nearly every tenancy agreement, there's a time between the service of the notice and the ability to effect a review. That's not to say that obviously sometimes the best deals are done which are outside a notice, but unfortunately, if the landlord doesn't agree, then you have no means of recourse then to third-party determination to secure a resolution to the issue that obviously would suit you. So in most Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies, firstly, rent reviews every 3 years, but in order to seek a rent review and to have the recourse and the strength of case, you need to serve a notice 12 months prior to the review date, at least 12 months, to make sure that you can refer it to third party if needs be. Just to say on budgets, I think this is where we do need to work together very closely to make sure that we produce the evidence that's needed. The one problem that has always been the case, and indeed the analysis over the years, has been we can produce a budget, and of course remember it isn't necessarily your budget, it is what a hypothetical tenant would do in that situation. So we have to add that interpretation, but with yield evidence and the like and the facilities that you have, then that obviously is a major part of the calculation of that formula. But the one problem we have at the end of the day is actually what is the landlord likely to be entitled to as a percentage of the cake? And over years, that has changed dramatically, where they might have received more than 50% of the net farm income to cases where it could be substantially less. But so those are factors to take into consideration. And probably the strongest factor to contemplate is the evidence, which is the comparables, because this is where people need to work together, and indeed in areas, because landlords are quite good at sort of taking cases forward on some particular ones where they feel there's an easy settlement, which might of course create the precedent that other people have to work to. So so consider the landlord's position and their needs. If we could flick forward then, Megan, a couple of slides, that would be to pass those on the tenancies, that would be helpful. So just looking now outside rent reviews, that was a brief insight into the considerations for that. I think the other things to remember in tenancy negotiation is what are the needs of the parties and what do people want to achieve out of some element of renegotiation. And I think we just wanted to flag up here some of the issues which the tenant might have in his armoury, which could help secure some sort of transition and some sort of benefit from the position which you have. Firstly, improvements in fixtures. I mean, quite regularly where a landlord is seeking a new tenancy, there can be, and indeed there might be, benefits to the tenant of securing, and indeed in a succession case, quite often improvements undertaken by the tenant could be passed to the landlord, which might receive some sort of commensurate benefit. So the landlord benefits from that in future rent reviews, but it also might be used by a tenant to secure advantage. I think the other major thing to remember is that those who have got protected Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies, there are significant taxation benefits to a landlord of converting that into an agricultural tenancy, a farm business tenancy, because obviously their rate of taxation relief could enhance from a 50% under an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy to a farm business tenancy, where they might be entitled to 100% taxation relief for inheritance tax purposes. Although let's watch this space, because I think we feel there could be some changes on taxation reliefs on the horizon. And clearly from a landlord's point of view, there's a big difference between the value of an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy as let and that which would be vacant possession. So there is a vacant possession uplift there, which could be quite useful, obviously, in a negotiation. Of course, the landlord also, in terms of income security, remember there's a freedom of contract under a farm business tenancy, which means that the contract duration, the review formulae and everything else can be there. But also remember, under farm business tenancies, and this is something quite a few landlords have used, you can then get to a position where you might be able to add things into a farm business tenancy, which aligns it then with what you had available and the security which you had available under a Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, namely succession and also rent reviews, are referring back to the rent formula in the Act rather than having the open market rent. Just a pitfall, just to say, remember, be very careful with variations to tenancy, and that you might lose succession rights if you're not careful. Surrender and regrant, we haven't got the time to articulate on that in detail. But also just one thing that can easily be forgotten is stamp duty land tax, in that if you do enter into a new agreement, that might leave a liability with the tenant for the payment of stamp duty land tax. And rent formula, just making sure that that's protected. So all the other aspects we've touched on briefly before. I'm conscious of time. Investments, diversification, I'll come to that again later when we look at the new bill as what is coming around the corner. Subsidies and delinking, clearly there's an area of conflict there sometimes between landlord and tenant, depending on the nature of the agreement and the most up-to-date formulae which are in those. And there is often quite a lot of protection for landlords in new farm business tenancy agreements. And then just look at the reviews and the exit clauses. One thing to say is be very, very careful if you are actually tendering for land, because obviously in this period of change, one thing to be acutely aware of is that once you're committed to a farm business tenancy agreement, unless there is a notice provision, you are committed for the duration, and that might be longer than the period of transition which we're going to, and may therefore lead to a situation where you could be caught with quite a high rent, which is unsustainable in the climate. Agricultural farm business tenancies are different to Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies in that under an AHA tenancy, you can give a year's notice at any stage to change the position. So on the horizon then, if we just move forward then to the next slide, if I may, many of you will have heard there is a bill which is finding its way, which obviously is the one that predominates and will obviously be the driver for the industry, not only in terms of the things that Greg's talked about already, but is also tucked away in Schedule 3 to that piece of legislation. There's some quite interesting changes, which I will just talk about briefly, which obviously are relevant to tenancies and what you might find is of assistance in the future, looking at your negotiations. The first one is just there is now some changes in that there is a reference in the in the bill to a professional authority, which means that arbitrators previously would be appointed by the RCS, but now they've opened the door a bit, and that's now open to the CAV, the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, and the Agricultural Law Association. Landlords consent to variation of terms. Now, the detail for this is yet to be established, but broadly speaking, I think what is envisaged here is to give tenants more flexibility and the ability to compel a landlord to allow them greater flexibility in terms of what they do on the holding. When this was going through the earlier gestation period and the earlier discussions, it was really geared to trying to facilitate diversification projects on a farm. And what this means is that a tenant can apply to get a direction that the landlord will have to accept. There could be variation of terms of the tenancy. Now, as I say, the detail will come in the regulation, but that is one really to watch this space on, which could lead to some fairly advantageous positions being negotiated, which will allow the diversification that we all expect will happen as we move into this position where probably increasing public access and other forms of subsidy will be payable. Arbitration, third-party determination, there's some quite useful moves there, because rather than arbitration, which of course has been always a little bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut, it is a very expensive process, but we're now enabling more third-party determination in a lot of things, including rent reviews, as you'll see below. Also, to mention, which could affect some people, and it's also relevant to the rolling up of delinking as well, which is relevant, is that previously succession, you can secure a succession position by obviously serving a retirement notice. And there is two contexts of tenancy here. There's firstly the position that you would find with a county council smallholding, and now that's been moved to be the pensionable age. But also in normal Agricultural Holdings Act, the 65 date is being now replaced by a retirement provision being entitled, a tenant is entitled to that at any stage. So that's quite helpful if those are wanting to pass on to the next generation. Succession, success, death or retirement, eligibility and suitability. There's a major change there in terms of the commercial unit test, which is going to get dropped, i.e. if you were in occupation of another commercial unit, that would mean disqualifying you from succession. But what's going to happen is they're going to beef up a little bit the suitability clause. But interestingly in that is those one of the increasingly more rigorous tests of suitability where there could be some environmental benefit which must be taken into account by the landlord. So touched on rent reviews already, and I think improvements is really, there's some clarity on rent reviews and improvements to make sure that it's clear when negotiating, and indeed to give greater flexibility for the parties to contract into improvements, to work together to secure advantage. So the summary there at the bottom of that slide is tenants' benefits, gives a lot in terms of securing consent for diversification, will assist with succession planning, disregards and clearly rent reviews. If we just move on to the next slide, only quickly just to say, which I think I've touched on briefly already, that the succession planning, as you'll know, those tenancies which predate the 12th of July 1984 carry with them two succession rights, that some of those may already have had the first succession, but that's the legislation which relates to this, and the tests are those which are stipulated. And as I say, the one which is now likely to move out is, or to be dropped, is the commercial unit test. But clearly in terms of the test, one of the principal ones to just focus on in a second or two will be the principal thoughts of livelihood test. Now remember, in the light of some of the things I've said before about negotiation, there are a lot of things that can be done to try and negotiate a position, and often succession planning and succession to tenancies is best dealt with by agreement. The tribunal process is a very long and convoluted process and extremely expensive. I'm afraid it might be that, some aggressive landlords might be, or those who feel as though they need to know more might choose that is the case, which clearly would happen in any event on death failing agreement. But remember that there is a good case for trying to negotiate something that might be beneficial in terms of the longevity of the tenancy and your ability to farm the property. We just flick to the next slide, please. So just in terms of top tips for succession planning, do you want it? Is it advisable? In most cases it will be, and of course it's a very valuable commodity, so hang on to it as long as you can, but start early and take advice. It is complicated. There are a lot of tests to go through, and accounts clearly are important. The important thing is to make sure that when partnerships agreements are being formulated, wills are being made, that there's a close liaison between the lawyer, the accountant and the land agent, just to make sure that the people, you put yourself in the best position proper. So then we can then talk about wills and addressing the tests. Those are those which we've mentioned about commercial unit and obviously suitability, financial standing, close relationship tests and everything else. And just word of warning as well, retirement notices, they are there to be used. And of course now the landlord should be more receptive to those, obviously if there's a change in the date. The key issue here is that remember that you can test the case with a landlord if you wish by serving a retirement notice, which starts the tribunal process. And so far as I know at this stage, there's no change to that process in that you don't have to take it all the way. The problem being that if you take it all the way to the tribunal and that application to that applicant is then deemed to be unsuitable or ineligible for the tenancy, then that means that that person is then barred from making a further claim. So it could be an expensive mistake to make. But remember, you can withdraw from that at any stage, and that might be something to test with the landlord at the same time, ideally, as starting an earlier discussion, taking advice and planning for what you need to do to get to a position to preserve the value of that very, to save that very valuable asset. So if we just move to the next slide, in terms of exit planning, if there are situations where, I was just asked to touch on this briefly, where tenancies are being surrendered, there's a whole plethora of things to take into consideration, but getting advice, consider the notices. Remember, you might need to give a year's notice. But always remember that be careful and don't do things too soon, too quickly before thinking about the landlord's reversion. In Agricultural Holdings Act, there is quite as massive difference between the value of the farm with or without a tenant in place. And usually it's nice to think that some of that vacant possession uplift will be preserved. Mitigation, just making sure that actions are taken to try and preserve the fixed equipment so that obviously that doesn't lead to big dilapidation claims. And remember, there's all things to claim like improvements, fixtures and crops. Complicated rules, but they're there to make sure that compensation is received, schemes and other claims. And just one other little tip in dilapidation, which would be the want of repair. Something that's regularly forgotten is that landlords claim, excuse me, for that is limited to the diminution in the value of the reversion, which sounds a bit convoluted, but it means that if the farm is worth X with the dilapidation and it's worth Y without, it's just the difference between the two, which, excuse me, marginally often doesn't make a great deal of difference. The final slide then, if I may, just a quick commentary. I'm sorry I'm running on a little bit, just about delinking. This, again, I can see being quite an area of contention in tenancies. It's where we've been to before when we moved from the IAC system to APS. That created a lot of tension and friction because of the disassociation of the right to claim from the land effectively to put into the hands of tenants the entitlements. Now, the delinking is obviously clearly a move that is coming. We know it's coming, and it's the gradual abolition of things in the future will lead to positions where people can capitalize on that in the future. What we don't know yet is what is going to be the reference period, which obviously will create that asset that can be delinked. The expectation probably is it probably will be 2022, but this is all yet to be decided through regulation. So again, these issues, and there's one of the things that's been muted at the moment is the ability, and I think it strikes me, and I've been to some DEFRA seminars, is that there was quite a lot of talk about the ability for retirement farmers to roll up the value of their entitlements through delinking to take a capital sum, which actually would, in a sense, provide them with a pension. And the intention is that this will actually start to liberalise the market and create more opportunity for young farmers. So those are things to watch out for. Depends a lot on your agreement as to whether you can do that, because a lot of the more recent farm business tenancy agreements would enable the landlord to take a claim to that delinking payment and to that delinking right. But I think the important thing is look at the agreements and take some advice.